far beyond the safety of any kingdom walls, deep inside a massive dry canyon of completely red rocks, a ruthless group of fully grown, heavily armed adult bandits had built a massive fortified camp. These were highly dangerous men, thick with muscle, who spent their days terrorizing peaceful trade routes and hoarding stolen wealth. The heavy midday sun baked the red dirt. The bandit camp was loud as the men sharpened their thick iron weapons. Suddenly, a deafening crash echoed through the canyon. The massive, thick wooden front gates of the camp violently exploded inward, completely shattering into heavy splinters. Through the rising red dust walked a single young man named Ijahka. He had a completely normal, handsome face without a single scar. He did not sneak in through the shadows, and he held absolutely no fear in his eyes. In his hands, he gripped two heavy, curved iron machetes. The massive adult bandits immediately stopped what they were doing and grabbed their weapons, completely surrounding the lone intruder. But Ijahka did not take a defensive stance. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the camp. Instead of showing fear, Ijahka raised his heavy iron blade and confidently pointed at the adult men. Using cold, aggressive gestures and a loud, commanding voice, he declared exactly how the ancient gods had already written their brutal deaths for this exact afternoon. He perfectly described the destruction that was about to happen, completely breaking their minds with his absolute, freezing confidence. He treated the heavily armed killers not as threats, but as completely doomed puppets in a story that was already finished. Deeply insulted and enraged by his bold confidence, a massive, heavily built adult bandit roared and charged forward. He thrust a thick, heavy wooden spear directly at Ijahka's chest. Ijahka did not even try to dodge. Instead, he violently stepped forward directly into the attack. The sharp iron tip of the heavy spear violently pierced completely through Ijahka's shoulder, bursting out of his back in an explosion of blood. The adult bandit froze in pure shock. He desperately tried to pull his heavy weapon free, but Ijahka flexed his heavy muscles, intentionally trapping the thick wooden shaft tightly inside his own broken bones. While the massive attacker struggled helplessly, Ijahka simply stepped closer. With his right hand, he forcefully swung his heavy, curved iron blade, cleanly severing the bandit's arm completely off. As the man fell to his knees in shock, Ijahka swung his left blade with terrifying power, brutally crushing the man's neck and sending him lifeless into the dirt. Another adult warrior charged from the side, swinging a massive solid wooden club directly at Ijahka's head. Ijahka reached out and violently caught the heavy club with his bare hand. The absolute force completely shattered the bones in Ijahka's fingers, but he did not even flinch. He violently pulled the club downward, throwing the attacker off balance, and drove his curved blade deeply into the man's chest, dropping him instantly. With the first two men dead, Ijahka calmly grabbed the thick wooden spear still stuck completely through his own shoulder. He forcefully yanked it out, dropping the bloody wood into the dirt. Then the true, terrifying magic of his curse revealed itself. The massive, fatal hole in his chest did not just bleed. The dry red sand and dirt from the rocky canyon floor suddenly began to swirl violently up his legs. The red earth magically crawled directly over his skin, rushing into the massive open wound. The dirt violently twisted and wove itself deep into his flesh, perfectly sealing the heavy injury in mere seconds. He casually cracked his completely broken fingers back into place, the red earth instantly fusing the shattered bones perfectly together without leaving a single scar. Seeing a normal-looking man heal perfectly from a fatal strike threw the remaining adult warriors into absolute freezing panic. Some tried to run, but Ijahka moved with completely terrifying, unnatural speed. He moved like a wild storm of iron. He completely ignored their defenses, intentionally letting their heavy swords slash his arms and chest just so he could get closer. Every time an enemy blade cut him, the red dirt instantly crawled up to heal his flesh, making him an absolutely unstoppable force. He violently swept the legs of fleeing bandits, pinning them heavily to the rocky ground before driving his twin iron blades completely through their chests. He grabbed one charging man by the throat, lifted him entirely off his feet, and violently slammed his back against a solid rock wall until the man stopped moving. In less than a few minutes, the entire heavily fortified bandit camp was completely wiped out. The adult warriors lay scattered across the red dirt in total defeat. The terrifying mercenary did not stop to rest or breathe heavily. He completely ignored the massive piles of stolen gold coins scattered across the camp. Ijahka walked directly into the dead bandit leader's tent. He searched the heavy wooden chests until he found his specific, highly rare payment. He pulled out a small tied pouch filled entirely with ancient white cowries taken from the dark graves of forgotten kings. Securing the rare payment, Ijahka walked calmly out of the bloody camp and disappeared into the hot, red desert, leaving absolute destruction behind him. To understand the absolute brutal massacre that Ijahka unleashed in the rocky canyon, one must fully understand the heavy wickedness of the adult bandits he destroyed. They were not ordinary thieves who simply stole heavy bags of grain or gold. They were terrifying desecrators. A few full moons ago, these massive, ruthless men launched a highly coordinated, violent attack in the dead of night. Their target was not a trade caravan, but the sacred, heavily guarded royal burial grounds belonging to the great kingdom of Zangala. Moving with pure savagery, the bandits brutally slaughtered the elite adult tomb guards, leaving their broken bodies scattered across the sacred dirt. They violently smashed open the sealed stone tombs of the ancient forgotten kings. Driven by deep, dark greed, they stole the sacred white grave cowries, ancient shells believed to hold the resting souls of the kingdom's greatest ancestors. They intended to sell these priceless spiritual items to dark sorcerers in distant lands. The theft of the grave cowries brought an absolute freezing terror to the kingdom of Zangala. It was an ancient belief that if the royal ancestors were violently removed from their resting place, the entire kingdom would suffer a heavy spiritual curse. And the curse quickly began to show. The heavy rivers surrounding Zangala started to mysteriously dry up, and the strong adult farmers watched helplessly as the crops withered into brown dust. The king of Zangala had sent his bravest adult warriors to the Red Canyon to retrieve the stolen cowries. But the royal army was completely massacred by the heavily fortified bandits. Desperate and running out of time, the high priest of Zangala was forced to seek out the one man who could survive an impossible, deadly mission. He hired the Immortal mercenary, promising him that his payment would be keeping a small handful of those very same ancient grave cowries, the only rare currency Ijahka ever accepted. Leaving the completely destroyed bandit camp behind, Ijahka walked for 3 full days and nights, across the hot, red desert until he finally reached the massive stone gates of the kingdom of Zangala. He did not seek the attention of the king, nor did he march proudly through the cheering village markets. He completely avoided the crowds, walking through the shadows directly to the grand stone temple at the very edge of the kingdom. Inside the dimly lit temple, the old high priest was kneeling in the dirt, praying desperately. Ijahka walked silently up behind him. Without making a single sound, the mercenary dropped the heavy, tied pouch of recovered white cowries directly onto the stone altar. The old priest turned around, his eyes going wide with pure shock and heavy relief. He checked the pouch, verifying the sacred items. The priest raised his hands to deeply bless the young warrior, but when he looked back up, Ijahka was completely gone, vanishing back into the shadows as quickly as he had arrived. Despite possessing terrifying, unstoppable power, Ijahka did not live a life of grand luxury. His normal life was completely opposite to the absolute violence he unleashed in battle. He lived entirely alone in a small, broken mud hut located at the very edge of the deepest, darkest forest, far away from any human village. The ordinary people of the world deeply feared him, quietly believing he was a cursed spirit. They completely avoided his part of the woods, and Ijahka preferred the absolute silence. In his normal life, he spent his days sitting perfectly still in the dry dirt outside his hut, calmly carving heavy pieces of wood or simply watching the wind blow through the thick trees. He did not feast, he did not seek the company of women, and he did not desire heavy gold. His deep connection to the red earth that constantly healed his immortal flesh made him appreciate complete, heavy stillness. He only left his isolated peace when the world of men created a dark, impossible problem that required a walking nightmare to solve. Deep in the eastern lands stood the massive, heavily fortified empire of Oruko. For centuries, the kingdom thrived in absolute peace, completely protected by a highly sacred, ancient item known as the Stone of the Deep. It was a massive, heavy black rock that glowed with a faint, unnatural heat, resting quietly inside the kingdom's central temple. The ancient gods had placed it there to hold the raw, fiery power of the earth together. The consequences of removing this sacred stone were completely different and far more violent than a simple drought. Without the Stone of the Deep anchored in the temple, the very ground beneath the kingdom began to violently reject the people. Massive, terrifying earthquakes aggressively shook the empire day and night. Deep, bottomless cracks violently tore open across the dirt roads, completely swallowing entire huts and livestock into the dark, fiery pits below. Thick, poisonous smoke began to rise from the broken earth, suffocating the innocent villagers. The sacred stone was not stolen by ordinary bandits. It was taken by a terrifying, elite group of fully grown adult assassins heavily trained by dark, underground sorcerers. They were known as the Silent Shadows. These brutal men were heavily corrupted by dark magic, possessing unnatural speed and fighting skills far superior to any normal human army. They moved completely like ghosts, leaving absolutely no footprints, no broken branches, and no scent behind. The king of Oruko was thrown into pure, freezing panic. His massive royal army was completely useless against ghosts, and his kingdom was actively tearing itself apart. Seeing the heavy destruction, the old temple priest approached the panicked king. He assured the ruler that there was exactly one walking nightmare capable of tracking the untrackable. He sent a desperate messenger to the edge of the dark forest to summon Ijahka. When Ijahka arrived at the shaking palace, he did not bow. He stood perfectly still as the ground trembled beneath his feet. The king desperately begged for his help, but Ijahka made a heavy, terrifying request. To face dark sorcerers, he demanded the absolute highest payment: unrestricted access to the king's personal, sacred bloodline tomb to harvest the rarest white grave cowries of the founding fathers. It was a massive, unthinkable taboo, but with the kingdom violently collapsing around him, the king had absolutely no choice but to agree. Ijahka set out immediately into the dark, thick wilderness. Tracking the silent shadows was the most difficult hunt of his life. Because they hovered above the dirt like ghosts, there were no heavy footprints to follow. But Ijahka possessed the absolute ultimate hunting instincts. He completely ignored the ground and looked at the environment. He tracked the unnatural silence of the forest birds, the completely dead leaves that had withered from the dark magic passing by, and the faint, bitter smell of black ash left in the air. For 3 long days and nights, he relentlessly pushed through the dangerous wild, slowly closing the invisible gap until he finally discovered their hidden, heavily fortified stronghold deep inside a dead rocky valley. Ijahka did not hide. He marched straight into the open clearing, drawing his heavy, twin-curved iron blades. The elite adult assassins instantly swarmed him, moving with terrifying, blinding speed. They wielded thick, spiked iron chains and heavy, poisoned spears. Ijahka immediately felt the massive difference in their strength. These were no ordinary bandits. Their strikes were heavily coordinated and brutally fast. 2 assassins aggressively threw their heavy, spiked chains, violently wrapping them tightly around Ijahka's arms to completely lock him in place. A 3rd assassin leaped into the air, driving a poisoned spear directly through Ijahka's stomach. But Ijahka simply weaponized his immortal flesh. Ignoring the heavy blade inside his stomach, he violently yanked his chained arms backward with raw, explosive strength. The force completely ripped the iron chains from the assassin's grips, violently pulling the 2 men forward into the air. Before they could hit the dirt, Ijahka swung his twin, curved blades in a devastating crossed motion, completely severing their heads. He then grabbed the assassin who had stabbed him, violently headbutted the man's face, crushing his nose, and drove his iron blade deeply through the enemy's chest. As the red dirt aggressively crawled up Ijahka's legs to perfectly heal his stomach wound, he moved like a wild, unstoppable storm. He violently ducked under heavy weapon swings, effortlessly slicing through the remaining assassins, leaving their broken bodies completely scattered across the dead valley. With the entire camp wiped out, Ijahka calmly retrieved the heavy, glowing stone of the deep from their dark altar. He turned around to leave the valley, expecting a quiet journey back. But the path was completely blocked. Standing in the narrow exit of the valley was a massive, heavily built adult warrior. The giant man did not look like the other assassins. He held a massive, thick iron executioner's axe, and there was absolutely no fear in his eyes. Ijahka completely relaxed his shoulders, assuming this was just another arrogant victim blocking his path. He charged forward with terrifying speed, swinging his heavy iron blade directly at the giant's thick neck. The blade struck perfectly, slicing deeply into the man's throat in a fatal, deadly blow. But the giant warrior did not fall. he did not choke or bleed out. Instead, the giant simply dropped his heavy axe and grabbed Ijahka by the throat with raw, impossible strength, violently throwing him backward into the hard rocks. Ijahka quickly recovered and looked closely at the massive warrior. Pure shock hit Ijahka's mind. The deep, fatal cut on the giant's neck was not bleeding. The dry dirt and black ash from the valley floor were violently swirling up the giant's massive legs, crawling directly over his skin and perfectly knitting the deep flesh wound back together in mere seconds. The man was exactly like him. He possessed the exact same terrifying healing factor, and he absolutely could not die. The giant picked up his massive iron axe, and the two immortal monsters clashed violently, shaking the very earth beneath them in a brutal, unending fight of raw, unbreakable flesh. This giant man, who is just like Ijahka, known in the dark underworld as Mokolo, was absolutely no ordinary warrior. He was a walking nightmare built exactly like him. Ijahka did not hesitate. He aggressively charged forward, throwing a massive, brutal punch directly into Mokolo's face. The pure, explosive force of the strike completely lifted the giant off his feet, sending him crashing heavily backward into the hard dirt. But Mokolo did not stay down. The giant instantly sprang back to his feet with terrifying speed and launched a brutal, savage counterattack. Mokolo swung his massive fist, but Ijahka swiftly ducked, perfectly dodging the heavy strike. However, before Ijahka could completely regain his balance, Mokolo delivered a blindingly fast, unexpected heavy leg strike directly to Ijahka's jaw. The bone-crushing kick violently sent Ijahka flying backward, crashing hard onto the rocky floor. Ijahka quickly rolled back to his feet, tasting thick blood in his mouth. He drew his twin curved iron swords, his eyes locked in absolute focus. Mokolo responded by dropping his heavy iron axe and drawing two thick, jagged iron blades of his own. The two immortal monsters violently clashed. Heavy iron aggressively sparked against iron. Because neither man feared death, they completely abandoned all defense. They fought with pure savagery, brutally slicing deep into each other's flesh. Ijahka violently slashed his curved blade across the giant's chest, while Mokolo instantly countered by driving his jagged sword deep into Ijahka's thigh. As they fought, the valley floor reacted. The red dirt violently swirled up Ijahka's legs, while the black ash crawled aggressively up Mokolo's body. The earth perfectly and instantly healed their massive, gaping wounds exactly as fast as the heavy blades created them. They moved like a terrifying storm of blood and iron, completely destroying the rocks around them. Stepping dangerously close, they violently locked their bodies together. In a raw display of absolute brutality, they simultaneously thrust their weapons forward, violently burying their heavy swords directly into each other's stomachs, right up to the iron hilts. They fought with savagery in the dirt, heavily locked together with blades through their bodies, glaring directly into each other's eyes. Suddenly, Mokolo released the heavy grip on his sword. Moving with blinding speed, the giant reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a handful of a strange, glowing gray powder. Before Ijahka could pull his own blade free, Mokolo violently blew the thick powder directly into Ijahka's face. The mysterious substance hit Ijahka's eyes and filled his lungs. For the very first time since receiving his dark curse, an absolute blinding agony completely overwhelmed his mind. The red earth violently struggled to heal the damage, but the burning powder was completely unnatural. Ijahka violently collapsed onto the rocky floor, screaming out loud in pure, terrifying pain, dropping his iron blades into the dirt. While Ijahka writhed completely blindly on the ground, struggling to breathe, Mokolo calmly grabbed the iron sword, still stuck completely through his own stomach, and violently pulled it out, dropping it into the dust. The black ash instantly healed the giant's stomach perfectly. Without saying a single word, Mokolo turned his back on the screaming mercenary. The giant calmly walked over to the altar, picked up the heavy, glowing stone of the deep, and completely disappeared into the thick shadows of the dark valley. As the burning pain slowly began to fade, Ijahka lay heavily in the dirt, breathing hard. The terrifying truth completely crushed his pride. This was the absolute first time he had ever been defeated since gaining his immortal power. He realized with freezing clarity that he was no longer the only monster in the world, and there was another immortal walking the earth who was undeniably stronger. As Ijahka lay completely blind and burning in the rocky dirt of the dead valley, his mind violently flashed backward. The intense pain pulled him deep into the heavy memories of a forgotten time. Long before he became a lonely, immortal mercenary hiding in the woods, Ijahka was a proud, highly respected adult warrior of a small, peaceful tribe. He was never alone in his battles. He fought back to back with his absolute best friend and sworn blood brother, a fierce, heavily built warrior. They were completely unstoppable together. But their peace was violently destroyed when a massive, wicked empire marched thousands of heavily armed soldiers into their land, determined to wipe their small tribe from the face of the earth. It was absolute brutal war. Ijahka and his brother stood alone in a burning valley, completely surrounded by hundreds of enemy soldiers. The two brothers fought like wild lions. Ijahka swung his heavy blades, slicing through enemy shields, while his brother aggressively crushed skulls with a massive iron club. But the enemy numbers were simply too massive. Slowly, their strength faded. A heavy spear violently pierced Ijahka's chest, throwing him backward onto the hard, dry red rocks. Moments later, a rain of heavy arrows brutally struck Ijahka's brother, dropping the massive warrior directly into a thick pile of burning black ash from the destroyed camp. Both brothers lay bleeding heavily, completely left for dead in the ruins of their home. As the heavy smoke cleared and the enemy army marched away, a single figure rushed frantically into the bloody valley. It was Ijahka's young wife, a highly gifted and powerful spiritual priestess. Seeing her beloved husband and his best friend bleeding out in the dirt, she refused to let them cross over to the land of the dead. Driven by pure, desperate love, she fell to her knees and performed a highly forbidden, dark ritual. She cut her own hands, letting her blood spill heavily onto the earth. She aggressively chanted ancient, dangerous, dark magic words, forcefully binding the fading life forces of the two dying men directly to the ground beneath them. Because Ijahka lay dying on the dry red rocks, the ancient magic permanently bound his flesh to the red dirt. Because his brother lay bleeding in the ruins of the fire, his soul was forcefully bound to the thick black ash. The heavy magic violently ripped through the valley. The earth aggressively swallowed their broken bodies, perfectly healing their fatal wounds and granting them both impossible immortality. But the powerful magic caused a massive, blinding explosion of dark energy that completely shattered the valley. When Ijahka finally opened his completely healed eyes, the valley was entirely empty. The explosive magic had violently thrown his brother far away. and the black ash had already begun to heavily corrupt his brother's body, twisting him over the years into an unrecognizable giant monster. This was the exact reason Ijahka did not recognize him during their brutal fight. Mokolo was Ijahka's brother, but the most terrifying horror was yet to come. The forbidden magic came with an absolute terrifying price, because the young priestess violently broke the strict laws of nature to make mortal men immortal. The ancient gods of the underworld were furiously angry. The dark sky violently ripped open, and heavy, unseen spiritual shadows forcefully dragged Ijahka's weeping wife down into the cold dirt, trapping her soul permanently in the dark underworld for endless torment. Before the shadows completely vanished, a deep booming voice from the underworld revealed the absolute only way to free her. The angry gods demanded a massive, impossible, spiritual ransom to buy his wife's soul back and grant her eternal peace. Ijahka had to pay them using the absolute rarest currency in the entire world, a massive amount of ancient white cowries taken strictly from the dark graves of royal kings. This heavy memory explained his entire lonely existence. Ijahka did not care about saving kingdoms, hoarding gold, or gaining power. He lived like a poor, isolated outcast, violently hunting down impossible targets and risking his immortal flesh completely for one single purpose: to secretly hoard enough royal grave cowries to finally buy back the trapped soul of the woman he loved. The heavy memory faded, and the violent burning in Ijahka's eyes completely stopped. The red earth of the valley floor violently swirled up his face, perfectly healing the damage caused by the strange grey powder. Ijahka slowly stood up in the completely empty dirt. The giant Mokolo was gone, and the heavy, glowing stone of the deep had been taken. For the absolute first time in his entire long life, Ijahka had completely failed a mission. This heavy failure meant the king of Oruko would absolutely not allow him into the royal tombs to collect the sacred white cowries he desperately needed for his wife. Ijahka stared at the dark footprints left by the giant in the black ash. His usual quiet, peaceful nature completely vanished, replaced by a dark, burned rage. He slowly picked up his heavy, half-twin curved iron blades from the dirt. He was no longer just a mercenary, completing a contract for a king. The mission had completely changed. The man who blinded him and stole his prize was his corrupted, lost brother, and he doesn't even know it's his brother. Ijahka tightened his heavy grip on his weapons and began the long, quiet walk out of the dead valley. The true hunt had just begun. Ijahka returned to the kingdom of Oruko, but the massive empire was already tearing itself completely apart. The glowing stone of the deep was the only thing holding the land together, and without it, the earth violently rejected the people. Massive, bottomless cracks violently ripped open the dirt roads, completely swallowing heavy stone huts into dark, fiery pits. Thick, poisonous gray smoke aggressively filled the sky, suffocating the innocent villagers as they ran in pure panic. Ijahka walked calmly through the chaos and approached the trembling royal platform. The king of Oruko looked at him with desperate hope, but Ijahka did not present the sacred stone. Using cold, bold gestures, Ijahka made it absolutely clear that the stone had been violently taken by an immortal giant, a monster who possessed the exact same terrifying healing powers as he did. The king fell to his knees in total despair, but Ijahka offered a heavy new deal. He would hunt this giant down, destroy him, and return the glowing stone. However, his price had violently increased. Ijahka demanded not just unrestricted access to the royal tombs, but he also demanded the king's personal, sacred crown, a heavy headpiece made entirely of the rarest ancient white grave cowries. With his massive kingdom violently collapsing around him into dust and fire, the desperate king had absolutely no choice but to agree. Ijahka immediately set out, leaving the collapsing kingdom behind. This time, tracking his target was completely different. He did not need to look for broken branches or footprint impressions in the mud. He used his deep, unnatural connection to the earth itself. He tracked a massive, terrifying trail of pure corruption. Everywhere the giant Mokolo had walked, the environment violently died. The massive green trees had completely withered into rotting black wood. The rivers had dried up into toxic sludge, and the normal brown dirt was heavily stained with a thick, cursed black ash. Ijahka followed this massive dead trail for days, his own red dirt heavily reacting and aggressively pushing back against the dark corruption left behind by his immortal enemy. The trail of dead earth eventually led Ijahka directly to a massive, terrifying stone fortress built aggressively into the side of a bleeding active volcano. The giant had not run away. He had violently taken over this dark stronghold, surrounding himself with a massive army of heavily armed adult warriors. Ijahka did not wait for the cover of night. He channeled his pure, burning rage and marched directly toward the heavy iron gates. A large group of adult guards charged forward, swinging heavy axes and thick iron chains. Ijahka moved like a completely unstoppable storm. He violently abandoned all defense. He intentionally allowed a massive adult guard to drive a thick iron sword deeply into his stomach. While the guard stared in shock as the red dirt violently swirled up to heal the fatal wound, Ijahka forcefully grabbed the man by the throat and violently crushed his windpipe. He swung his twin curved iron blades with devastating speed, perfectly slicing through thick wooden shields and severing limbs. He brutally butchered his way straight through the heavy front gates, leaving a massive trail of broken adult bodies completely scattered across the volcanic ash. As Ijahka aggressively cut his way deeper into the dark stone fortress, completely unaware of the true dangers awaiting him, the deep, hidden history of the giant's dark ambition finally became clear. Years ago, during the desperate, forbidden ritual performed by the young priestess to save the dying men, a massive spiritual imbalance had occurred. When the priestess violently broke the laws of nature to bind flesh to the earth, the magic ripped a temporary hole in the veil, separating the human world from the dark spiritual dimension. In that chaotic fraction of a second, a terrifying ancient demonic spirit successfully escaped the spiritual prison and violently possessed Mokolo's unconscious body. The heavy, explosive magic of the ritual had a terrible side effect. Both Ijahka and Mokolo lost massive parts of their memories. Ijahka remembered his wife and his mission to save her soul, but his memory of his brother was heavily blurred and forgotten. Mokolo woke up with his mind completely empty, giving the invading demonic spirit the absolute perfect advantage. The demon easily took total control of the giant's brain, manipulating his empty memories and twisting him into a dark, ruthless conqueror. The demon inside Mokolo did not care about human wealth, and it certainly did not steal the glowing stone of the deep to sell it. Over the years, the possessed giant had violently gathered a massive army of corrupted soldiers for one specific, dark ambition. Deep inside the spiritual dimension, a much more powerful, apocalyptic god of destruction had been heavily trapped in a dark prison for thousands of years. The demon controlling Mokolo desperately wanted to free its master. The glowing stone of the deep held the raw, fiery power of the earth itself. Mokolo intended to violently crush the sacred stone and use its massive, explosive energy to completely shatter the spiritual prison, releasing the god of destruction to wipe out the entire human world. Ijahka violently kicked open the massive wooden doors to the inner throne room. Deep inside the dark chamber, the giant Mokolo stood over a heavy stone altar. The glowing stone of the deep rested on the cold rock, burning fiercely as Mokolo aggressively chanted dark, ancient words over it, trying to shatter the spiritual prison. Ijahka did not hesitate. He aggressively charged across the room, completely initiating the brutal rematch. Mokolo stopped his dark chant, forcefully grabbed his massive iron executioner's axe and swung it with terrifying, world-shaking power. The heavy iron axe violently slammed directly into Ijahka's chest, completely crushing his ribs and throwing him backward. But before Ijahka even hit the floor, the red dirt violently swirled over his chest, perfectly healing the crushed bones. He landed on his feet, immediately sliding aggressively under the giant's massive legs. With a devastating double swing of his curved blades, Ijahka deeply slashed the back of Mokolo's knees. The giant fell heavily to the stone floor, but he instantly struck back. Mokolo violently kicked his massive foot backward, catching Ijahka squarely in the stomach. The raw force sent Ijahka flying backward, completely crashing through a thick stone pillar in an explosion of dust. Ijahka quickly rolled through the falling rocks, drawing a smaller iron blade and violently throwing it through the air. The blade aggressively pierced Mokolo's thick shoulder, forcefully pinning the giant to the heavy stone wall. The two immortal monsters violently clashed back and forth across the throne room. They brutally traded heavy, flesh-tearing blows. Ijahka sliced deeply into the giant's arms, while Mokolo violently crushed Ijahka's shoulders. The red dirt and the black ash aggressively swirled around the room, perfectly and instantly healing every single massive wound they inflicted on each other. As the bloody fight raged on, Ijahka quickly realized that simply stabbing the giant was completely useless. The black ash healed Mokolo far too fast. Ijahka's mind formed a dark, brilliant, and brutal strategy. He decided to completely chop the giant's body into separate pieces and bury the severed parts far away from each other, ensuring the dark ash could absolutely never reconnect them. Relying entirely on his completely superior speed, Ijahka took total control of the battle. He began brutally dominating the massive warrior. Mokolo swung his heavy axe downward, trying to crush Ijahka's skull, but Ijahka violently sidestepped the massive weapon. Using the heavy handle of the giant's own axe as a stepping stone, Ijahka forcefully leaped high into the air and landed directly onto Mokolo's massive back. Moving with blinding, unstoppable speed, Ijahka violently drove the heavy iron hilts of both his curved blades directly into the back of the giant's knees and shoulders. The absolute, crippling force violently broke Mokolo's balance, completely pinning the massive warrior face down onto the hard stone floor. Ijahka stood completely victorious over the pinned giant. He raised his heavy, curved iron blade high above his head, aiming directly at the giant's thick neck, absolutely ready to sever the head and begin tearing the body apart. But in that exact fraction of a second, the giant aggressively turned his face upward. Ijahka looked directly into Mokolo's eyes. Instantly, the heavy dark spiritual block completely shattered inside Ijahka's mind. A massive, overwhelming flood of true, clear memories violently rushed into his brain. He saw the forgotten burning valley. He saw the massive war. He saw the face of his brother laughing beside him in battle. The horrifying, undeniable truth completely crashed over him. The monster he was about to brutally butcher was his own sworn blood brother. Completely paralyzed by pure shock and heavy heartbreak, Ijahka's arms began to shake violently. He froze completely, entirely unable to swing the fatal blade. Because Ijahka dropped his guard and hesitated, the ancient demonic spirit completely abandoned its hiding place and took total control of Mokolo's physical body. The giant's eyes violently turned completely pitch black. The demon did not use the iron axe. It unleashed raw, ancient dark magic. A massive, violently heavy wave of dark spiritual energy blasted completely out of Mokolo's body, striking Ijahka directly in the chest. The terrifying dark magic aggressively rotted the red dirt on Ijahka's skin, violently burning his flesh in a way his immortality could absolutely not heal. Ijahka was violently thrown across the massive room, crashing weakly to the floor, completely defenseless against the dark god. The possessed giant slowly raised his heavy axe to completely destroy Ijahka. But suddenly, an old, mysterious spiritual priest calmly stepped out from the deep shadows of the throne room. This ancient man had been secretly tracking the dark demon's path of destruction for years, completely waiting for this exact, perfect opportunity. Before the demon could swing the heavy axe, the old priest forcefully threw a massive handful of glowing, sacred white sand directly into the giant's pitch-black eyes. The sacred magic violently burned the demon. The thick, dark spiritual shadow was forcefully ripped completely out of Mokolo's physical body, trapped screaming in the air by the glowing white sand. Seeing his absolute only chance, Ijahka fought through the agonizing pain, forcefully pushing himself off the floor. He aggressively charged forward and swung his heavy iron blade directly through the exposed dark spiritual shadow. The strike caused a massive, blinding flash of light. The ancient demon was violently banished back to the dark underworld forever, completely shattering into nothingness. The giant Mokolo heavily collapsed onto the cold stone floor, finally free, completely unconscious and safely breathing, leaving his exhausted brother to safely rest and recover in the silent fortress. Ijahka carefully wrapped the heavy glowing stone of the deep and carried it completely out of the dead valley. He journeyed directly back to the kingdom of Oruko and successfully returned the sacred item to the royal temple. The exact moment the stone touched the ancient altar, the massive earthquakes completely stopped. The deep, fiery cracks in the earth perfectly sealed themselves shut. The toxic gray smoke completely vanished from the sky, and the land was instantly healed. The deeply grateful king honored his heavy promise. He granted Ijahka the sacred royal crown entirely made of ancient white cowries, and allowed him to safely harvest enough grave cowries from the royal tombs to completely fulfill the massive underworld ransom. Ijahka traveled far away into the quiet, isolated depths of his dark forest. He knelt perfectly still in the dirt and performed the heavy, ancient ritual, offering the massive pile of rare, white royal cowries directly to the earth. The wind completely stopped. The dark woods glowed with a beautiful, soft light. Slowly, the peaceful, glowing spirit of his beautiful young wife materialized in the air directly before him. Ijahka reached his heavy, scarred hands out, desperately wanting to pull her back into the physical world to live with him forever. But the glowing spirit gently shook her head. Using soft, deeply emotional gestures, she clearly made him understand that the world was finally in perfect balance. She explained that if he forced her spirit back into a physical body, it would violently break the ancient laws of nature again, causing much more massive, terrifying destruction to innocent humanity. She slowly raised her glowing hand and gently wiped a single heavy tear from Ijahka's face. Through a beautiful, warm smile, she deeply thanked him for completely freeing her from the dark torment of the underworld. Ijahka slowly lowered his hands, heavily accepting her final choice. He dropped to his knees in the quiet dirt, watching silently as a beautiful spirit slowly faded away into the peaceful light. The immortal legend remained completely alone in the dark forest, but for the absolute first time in his long, bloody life, his heavy heart was finally at peace.